I was forced to work for a secret organization. What we found in Sublevel 6 will haunt me until I die. Around the 1950s, interdimensional rifts began appearing across the world. At first they seemed harmless, mere anomalies, in space that had no visible impact on our reality. However, nearly a decade later, strange occurrences began. Objects started disappearing and reappearing minutes later. At first it was insignificant things, keys, books, cutlery, but as time passed, the scale of these anomalies escalated. Larger objects vanished without explanation. Then people began to disappear. At first, those who went missing would return after a short time, seemingly unharmed but with no memory of what had happened. But as the years went on, the disappearances grew longer. Days, weeks, even months. Most of the returnees had no recollection of where they had been, as if time itself had erased their experiences. However, a few unfortunate individuals did remember, and what they described left them deeply traumatized. They spoke of incomprehensible landscapes, of being watched by something unseen, of hearing whispers in languages no human had ever spoken. Some returned in far worse conditions, missing limbs, their bodies bearing impossible wounds. What was most disturbing was that these injuries showed signs of advanced healing, as though they had been missing for years despite the person being gone only a short while. The medical impossibility of this suggested one terrifying conclusion. Wherever they had gone, time moved at a drastically different rate than our own. As these incidents became more frequent and more disturbing, governments and scientific institutions scrambled for answers. In response, a secret organization was formed to study and, if possible, contain these anomalies. This organization became known as the Walker Foundation, named after its founder, the late Dr. Walker. Now you may be wondering why I'm telling you all this. Well, I was a researcher for the foundation, stationed at Phoenix Ridge Institute, the very heart of their operations, the mother base of all research into these phenomena. I had graduated at the top of my class at Harvard with a degree in quantum theory. My theories on interdimensional physics had gained some traction in certain academic circles, but apparently they also caught the attention of the foundation. I would love to say that when they offered me a position, I had the freedom to decline, but that wasn't the case. If I recall correctly, their exact words were, "Due to your knowledge of the anomalies, you have two choices, work for us or go 6 feet under." So, as you can imagine, I didn't have much of a choice. Now, what I'm about to tell you is technically classified information, but considering that I'm currently bleeding out, I might as well not die for nothing. Someone needs to know what happened. Someone needs to understand what came through the rift and why it must never happen again. It all started a few months after I began working at the Institute. By then, I had settled into the routine, grown accustomed to the endless security clearances, the sleepless nights spent analyzing data, and the unsettling hum of machines scanning things that shouldn't exist. Despite the secrecy and the ever-present feeling that we were meddling in forces far beyond our comprehension, Phoenix Ridge had started to feel like a second home, and I had even made a friend, Mark. I still remember the first day we met. It was during lunch, and I was sitting alone in the courtyard, absent-mindedly picking at the food on my tray. The air was thick with the scent of damp concrete and sterilized metal, the kind of artificial cleanliness that never quite masked the deeper sense of decay. I had barely taken a bite when I heard someone pull up a chair beside me. "They threatened to kill you too, huh?" I blinked, caught off guard by the bluntness of his words. For a second I just stared at him, trying to gauge whether he was joking. He wasn't. There was something in his expression, an understanding, a shared weight that told me he already knew my answer. I exhaled, giving a dry, humorless chuckle. Yeah, gotta love a job offer you can't refuse. Mark smirked and sat down across from me, setting his tray down with a clatter. "Welcome to the club, then. The press ganged into top-secret science society. Perks include constant surveillance, ethically questionable experiments, and the ever-present possibility of being retired if you learn too much." I stabbed at my food with a fork, suddenly not feeling very hungry. "Sounds like a dream." "Oh, it gets better," Mark said, lowering his voice. "Wait until you see what they're hiding in Sublevel 6. Phoenix Ridge sat perched on a mountain, nestled deep within an expanse of dense, untamed wilderness. There wasn't a single sign of civilization for miles. No towns, no roads, nothing but towering evergreens and jagged rock formations stretching endlessly into the horizon. The perfect place for a top-secret organization that no one needed to know existed. On the surface, it looked unassuming, a simple, sterile-looking research facility with little more than a few hangars, administrative buildings, and the occasional armed patrol. But that was just the facade. The real Phoenix Ridge wasn't above ground. It was buried deep within the mountain, descending into the very crust of the earth like a subterranean labyrinth of reinforced steel and concrete. The deeper you went, the more restricted things became. Security checkpoints, biometric scans, armed guards at every turn. Each level housed secrets more dangerous than the last. My clearance only allowed me access up to Sublevel 5, where research teams studied anomalies in controlled environments. Beyond that, I had no idea. Anything past Sublevel 5 wasn't just restricted, it didn't officially exist. At least, that's what I thought. Somehow Mark had managed to get his hands on a Sublevel 6 access card. I never asked how. Some things were better left unknown. "It'll be fine," Mark whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of fluorescent lights. He flashed me a grin, though there was a nervous edge to it. "As long as we go between guard shifts, they won't catch us." I swallowed hard, glancing down at the stolen access card in his hand. It felt heavier than it should have. "And if they do?" I asked. Mark smirked. "Then we run like hell." So we did it. We went down to Sublevel 6. It was surprising how easy it was. Too easy. Mark and I expected resistance, security patrols, automated defenses, something to stop us from going where we weren't supposed to. But there was nothing. Just an open corridor dimly lit by flickering fluorescence, stretching into the depths of Phoenix Ridge. No cameras followed us, no alarms blared. It felt like we had walked into a place long since abandoned. If only I had taken that emptiness more seriously. We moved cautiously, our footsteps echoing against the cold metal floor. The silence was unnatural, sterile and absolute, as if the entire level had been sealed away from the rest of the world. Then came the smell. Thick, coppery, the scent of blood. Mark's grip on the stolen access card tightened. He gestured toward a set of reinforced doors ahead, marked with bold red warnings. Biological hazard. Level 6 clearance required. Authorized personnel only. "This has to be it," Mark whispered. I didn't want to go in. Every nerve in my body told me that whatever had been locked away behind those doors should stay locked away, but Mark had already swiped the card. The scanner flickered green. The doors groaned open. A wave of thick, damp air rushed out, heavy with decay. I gagged, my stomach twisting at the stench. Mark covered his nose with his sleeve, his face pale. We stepped inside. The chamber was massive, stretching into darkness beyond the reach of the overhead lights. Reinforced glass containment units lined the walls, their interiors clouded with frost. Some were still sealed. Others were shattered, thick cracks, spiderwebbing across the glass, dark stains pooling beneath them. And then there were the handprints, everywhere, smeared across the walls, trailing down the floor. Some were human, others had too many fingers. Mark took a slow step forward. "Jesus," he muttered. "What the hell happened here?" Then we heard it, a sound like wet fabric sliding across metal. Something moving in the dark, slow, methodical, a dragging sound. Mark and I froze. My breath hitched in my throat. The noise was coming from the far end of the chamber, past the broken containment units, past the streaks of dried blood. Then it came into view. A figure, humanoid, but wrong. Its skin was stretched taut, sickly pale beneath the dim lights. Its arms were too long, its fingers gnarled and stiff. The way it moved was unsettling, its legs bent at unnatural angles, yet it carried itself with an eerie, effortless grace. But it was the body it dragged that made my stomach lurch. The corpse was massive, easily twice the creature's size. A man in a tattered lab coat, his arms limp, his skull caved in. A body that should have been too heavy for something so thin, so frail-looking, Yet the thing pulled it with ease, like it weighed nothing at all. Mark inhaled sharply. "We need to..." The thing dropped the body and started moving, fast. Mark barely had time to finish his sentence before the thing lunged. It didn't move like something that had learned to walk. It moved like something that had learned to chase. Its limbs jerked unnaturally, snapping into place like a puppet on tangled strings, but its speed was terrifying. The moment it dropped the body, it closed half the distance between us in seconds. Mark grabbed my arm and yanked me backward. "Run!" We bolted. Our boots pounded against the floor, our breath ragged. The door was still open. If we could just reach it... A sharp clang rang out behind us. I risked a glance over my shoulder. The thing had hit the ground. Not tripped, not collapsed. It had just dropped, like its legs had suddenly given out. Its arms twitched, its fingers flexing against the floor, nails scraping against the metal. Then it started to rise. Not like a person getting up, like something being pulled upright by invisible strings. I felt bile rise in my throat. The way its joints twisted, the way its body convulsed. It was like it didn't have full control over itself, like it wasn't meant to be moving at all. Yet it was, and it was getting faster. Mark made it to the doorway first. He slammed his hand against the panel. The door hesitated, just a second, but a second too long. The thing let out a sound, not a scream, not a growl. A deep, guttural clicking like bones snapping over and over again in its throat, and then it jumped. I barely dove through the doorway in time. Mark hit the override panel on the other side, and the metal doors slammed shut just as the creature collided with them. The impact shook the walls. A second later, something scraped against the metal. Slow, deliberate, like fingernails dragging along the surface. Then, silence. I slumped against the opposite wall, chest heaving. Mark was beside me, hands shaking. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Neither of us could. Then Mark turned to me, his face pale. "We need to get the hell out of here." I nodded, forcing myself to stand. "Yeah, but first..." I glanced at the terminal near the door. It had a security log. I swiped the screen, scrolling back to the last recorded entries. My stomach dropped. The logs ended 3 weeks ago. And the last recorded entry was from Dr. Adams. Log 4. Sebastian really messed up. I told him the rift was too unstable, that it needed to be contained. But he wouldn't listen. He never listened. And now, because of his arrogance, I'm watching that stubborn fool being torn apart. His screams won't stop. I can hear the wet crunch of bone, the tearing of flesh, the thing's guttural growls between bites. I should look away, but I can't. I know I'm next. Whoever is reading this, listen to me carefully. Run. Run as fast as you can. That thing cannot be killed. We tried. God knows we tried. Bullets fire, electric surges. It only seemed to amuse it. And it's hungry. If my calculations are correct, it has enough food down here to last 3 weeks. After that, when the bodies are gone, it will start hunting. It will need to hunt. And if you're anywhere nearby when that happens, you won't have time to react. We should have killed it the moment we had the chance. Why do we always choose research over survival? Why do we insist on understanding what only wants to consume us? This entity, it's classified as a beta. And we've only ever documented 2 betas since the Foundation was established. The first wiped out an entire containment facility before we could even classify its behavior. This one might be worse. The others are gone. The doors won't hold. And I can hear it moving again. The crunching stopped. Oh God, it's done eating. End of log. Mark and I didn't waste another second. The scraping sound against the door had stopped, but the silence was worse. It felt like the calm before a storm, like the thing on the other side was waiting, calculating. I didn't want to find out what it was planning. "We need to get to the surface," Mark said, his voice low but urgent. "If that thing gets out of Sublevel 6, the whole facility is done for." I nodded, my mind racing. The security logs had mentioned that the entity had enough food to last 3 weeks. If the logs ended 3 weeks ago, that meant it was out of food. And if it was out of food, it would start hunting. We were the closest prey. We moved quickly but quietly, retracing our steps through the dimly lit corridors. The air felt heavier now, charged with a tension that made every sound, every creak of metal, every hum of machinery feel like a warning. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could see the same fear reflected in Mark's eyes. As we reached the elevator, Mark swiped his stolen access card. The doors slid open with a soft ding and we stepped inside. I hit the button for Sublevel 1, the surface level, but the elevator didn't move. Instead, the lights flickered and a cold draft seeped through the cracks in the doors. "What the hell?" Mark muttered, jabbing the button again. The elevator shuddered, and for a moment I thought it was going to work. But then the lights went out completely, plunging us into darkness. The emergency lights flickered on a second later, casting an eerie red glow over the small space. "We're not alone," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Mark didn't respond, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small flashlight, clicking it on. The beam of light cut through the red haze, but it did little to ease the growing sense of dread. The elevator jerked suddenly, and we both stumbled. The doors creaked open, but we weren't on Sublevel 1. We were somewhere deeper, somewhere we hadn't been before. The corridor beyond was dark, the walls lined with pipes and wires that hissed and sparked. The air was thick with the smell of rust and decay, and the floor was slick with something I didn't want to identify. Mark shone the flashlight down the corridor, revealing a series of doors, each marked with the same red warnings we'd seen on Sublevel 6. "This isn't right," Mark said, his voice tight. "We didn't go down. We should be going up." I didn't have an answer. The elevator had taken us somewhere it wasn't supposed to, and I had a sinking feeling that it wasn't a malfunction. Something had brought us here. We stepped out of the elevator cautiously, the doors sliding shut behind us with a finality that made my stomach churn. The corridor stretched ahead, disappearing into darkness. Somewhere in the distance, I heard a sound, a low guttural growl that sent a chill down my spine. "We need to move," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Mark nodded, and we started down the corridor, the beam of the flashlight our only guide. The doors we passed were all sealed, their warning labels faded and peeling. Some of them had handprints, human and otherwise, smudged across the glass. Then we heard it. The sound of something moving, dragging itself across the floor. It was close, too close. Mark swung the flashlight around, and the beam caught something in the shadows, a figure hunched and twisted, its two long limbs splayed at unnatural angles. It was the beta entity. It turned its head slowly, its eyes reflecting the light like a predator's. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of jagged teeth, and it let out that same guttural clicking sound we'd heard before. "Run!" Mark shouted, and we took off down the corridor. The thing was fast, faster than anything I'd ever seen. It moved like a spider, its limbs skittering across the walls and ceiling as it chased us. I could hear it gaining on us, the sound of its claws scraping against metal growing louder with every second. We rounded a corner, and Mark slammed his hand against a control panel. A door slid open, and we dove through, the door slamming shut behind us. The thing hit the door with a force that shook the walls, and I heard the sound of claws digging into metal. "This way," Mark said, pulling me down another corridor. We ran until we reached a stairwell, the door marked with a sign that read, "Surface Access." Mark yanked the door open, and we started up the stairs, taking them two at a time. The sound of the beta entity faded behind us, but I knew it wasn't gone. It was still out there, hunting. When we finally reached the surface, the cold night air hit me like a slap. The stars were bright overhead, and the moon cast a pale light over the facility. But there was no time to appreciate the view. We needed to get as far away from Phoenix Ridge as possible. Mark led the way to a parked Jeep near the entrance. He jumped into the driver's seat, and I climbed in beside him. The engine roared to life, and we sped down the mountain road, the facility disappearing behind us in a cloud of dust. For a moment, I thought we might actually make it. Then the Jeep lurched violently, and the world spun. I barely had time to register what was happening before we crashed into a tree, the impact throwing me against the dashboard. Pain shot through my side, and I tasted blood in my mouth. I looked over at Mark. He was slumped against the steering wheel, blood trickling down his face. "Mark!" I shouted, shaking him. "Wake up!" He groaned, his eyes fluttering open. Go, he muttered, his voice barely audible. You need to go. Not without you, I said, trying to pull him out of the jeep. But he pushed me away, his strength surprising me. Listen to me, he said, his voice urgent. That thing is still out there. It's not going to stop. You need to warn people. You need to tell them what's happening. I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. I can't do this alone. Mark grabbed my arm, his grip tight. You're not alone. You've got the logs. You've got the truth. Now go. I hesitated, but the sound of something moving in the trees made my blood run cold. The beta entity was close. Too close. Mark shoved me again, harder this time. Go! He shouted. I stumbled back, my heart breaking as I turned and ran. I didn't look back, I couldn't. But I heard the sound of the beta entity closing in, and I heard Mark's final defiant shout. Then there was silence. I don't have much time. I can feel the blood pooling beneath me, the cold seeping into my bones. My vision is blurring and every breath feels like a struggle. But I need to finish this. I need to tell you what happened. Someone has to know. Mark is gone. He didn't make it. We crashed the jeep trying to escape, and he stayed behind to buy me time. I don't know if it was enough. I don't know if I'm far enough away. But I can still hear it. The clicking, the scraping, the sound of something moving in the shadows. It's out there. And it's coming. I managed to send some of the logs before the crash. I don't know if they'll go through. The signal out here is spotty at best, and I don't even know who I sent them to. But if you're reading this, if you've seen the files, you need to listen. The Walker Foundation isn't what they say they are. They've been lying to everyone. The rifts, the entities, the experiments, it's all real. And it's worse than anyone could imagine. The thing we saw in Sublevel 6, it's not human. It's not even from this world. It's something else, something that doesn't belong here. And it's not the only one. There are others. The Foundation has been studying them, trying to control them, but they don't understand what they're dealing with. These things, they're not just dangerous, they're wrong. They don't follow the rules of our reality. They don't think like we do. And they're hungry. I don't know how much longer I have. The pain is getting worse, and I can't feel my legs anymore. But I need to warn you. If you're near Phoenix Ridge, if you hear about strange disappearances or unexplained phenomena, run. Don't try to investigate. Don't try to help. Just get as far away as you can. And if you work for the Foundation, if you're reading this and you know what I'm talking about, you need to stop. Whatever they've told you, whatever they've promised you, it's not worth it. The things they're doing, they're playing with forces they can't control. And when it all goes wrong, and it will go wrong, there won't be anyone left to clean up the mess. I can hear it now. It's closer. The clicking, the scraping. It's right outside. I don't have much time. Please, if you're reading this, don't let this happen again. Don't let them keep lying. Don't let them keep experimenting. The rifts are real. The entities are real. And if we're not careful, they're going to destroy everything. I'm sorry I couldn't do more. I'm sorry I couldn't stop it. It's here.